hopefully there'll be some good and interesting questions for us this evening. The questions probably best if they're asked live, but there is also the chat feature, the Zoom chat feature, if anyone wants to ask a question via that. But otherwise, I'll take live questions. And I can already see on my screen Alan with his jumping up and down enthusiastically and eagerly. There's a little bit of a minhag in their Q&As that Alan Bornstein always gets the first question. Interestingly, I did a Q&A with the Nair youth, and Joel Bornstein, believe it or not, also got in with the first question. So Alan, I'm pleased to see that this is becoming a generational experience. So Alan, I'll hand over to you, and if you unmute yourself, I'll be able to hear you. The truth is, on the subject of mute, I've been learning quite a lot from the Zoom experience, and when we resume shul life, one of the features of the new Nair will be that I'm going to have a Zoom button, a mute button on my stender, and we'll be able to mute anyone I wish to. So this is the admin rights of Zoom. But Alan, you're off mute now, so over to you.
All right, Rabbi Zobin, it's already installed for the moment you get back.
Thank you, Simon.
Rabbi Zobin, good evening, and first of all, thank you for your leadership in these unprecedented times.
Thank you.
We have unfortunately seen in the last few weeks many deaths in the religious communities on an unprecedented level, to the extent that many people are saying that the failure to follow government leadership, government guidelines in the United States, in Britain, and in Israel is a partial cause of these deaths. And I'm saying that this has been the greatest failure in rabbinic leadership since World War II. Do you agree with that assertion, which is not mine, but it is something that people have said? And do you think post COVID-19 that there will be any change in attitude either from the rabbinic leadership in trying to influence their flock, or from the flock being influenced by the rabbinic leadership?
Okay, Alan, thank you for starting things off with an easy and non-controversial question. When I do Q&As on a Shabbos afternoon, the thing that reassures me is that it's a Shabbos afternoon and no one's recording me, hopefully, and therefore I can just deny what's ever being quoted in my name. But I'm conscious that I'm here on Zoom, and I see on the icon being recorded also. I'll say 2 points. The first point is that I am very conscious that in the midst of a tragedy and a exceptionally painful experience communally and nationally and globally, it's a difficult time to do an analysis of everything that's happened. And I think that when the dust settles, and when we as a community and a global community begin a healing process, obviously we will need to look at lessons learned, and some of those may include noting which mistakes have been made. But I think in the midst of a crisis like this, it's not easily helpful or fair or positive or kind or empathetic to engage in that, and could end up in causing deeper distress to people who are already suffering. I think this applies to our own community, this applies to government response, and the global community response. I think there's a lot that needs to be worked out in terms of the global response, the role of different countries in this story, the role of our own government and its preparedness or otherwise, and the policies it adopted, and yes, the role of our own communal leadership, lay leadership and rabbinic leadership. But I think at the moment now, when emotions are high, when we are all suffering and all hurting, that's not the right time to engage in this process. And I think one can often have this thought at a time of suffering, and can look at someone who is who's maybe just departed, we've lost someone, and you can think about their lifestyle, and you can think about their health, and you can think about the choices they made. And I don't think those are the appropriate emotions and sentiments at the time. So that's the first point I would say. The second point I would say is that, and I'm happy to be on the record for this, I think rabbinic leadership, like any leadership, can and does make mistakes. I don't believe in a model of rabbinic leadership that claims some sort of papal infallibility for rabbinic leadership, other than myself, of course. That was a joke. The halachic system talks about rabbinic leadership that makes a mistake. It talks about a Sanhedrin that is judging capital punishments and condemns the murderer. And then Bar Horog Baraglov, the supposed victim of the court case which the Sanhedrin has just decided to penalize the criminal, then the victim walks in. We read just a couple of weeks ago Parashat Tzav, which talks about Asher Nossi Yechter, a Jewish people, leader of the Jewish people, the Nossi, who makes a mistake and sins. And I think that rabbinic leadership is not perfect. Rashi comments on the language of Asher Nossi Yechter, the carbon chatos, the sin offering that has to be brought when a leader sins. And the language used by the Torah is Asher, that, which sounds like in Hebrew, it's a positive that. In Hebrew, you can use the word pen, which means lest. What happens if, in a negative case, a leader sins? But Asher Nossi Yechter means how great it is that a leader sins. And Rashi comments on that. Ashri Hador, how happy is the generation, Asher Nossi Yechter, where the leader of the generation can admit they made a mistake. And I think leadership, rabbinic and otherwise, can make mistakes. And the judgment of leadership and its qualities is their ability to admit that they made a mistake. I'll tell a little Godel story, if you wish to hear one. A rabbinic colleague of mine was once discussing the leadership in Anglo Jewry, and he made a critical comment about Rabbi Mervis, our current chief rabbi. And he said that Rabbi Mervis had said in his shul XYZ, and he strongly disagreed with it. This was a rabbi of a small shul and fairly junior stature within Anglo Jewry. So I said to him, how did you react? What did you do about this? So he said, well, actually, I wrote an email to Rabbi Mervis. So I said, how did Rabbi Mervis respond? He said, well, he didn't get back to me for ages. So I said, well, that's fair, he's a busy man, but how did he respond? So he said, well, about 7 months later, he wrote to me thanking me for my email and criticism, saying he had thought it through, thought there was some justice in my comments, and he wouldn't share this thought in that particular way again. Now, I consider this a great story. I consider this an incredible story. Asher Nossi Yechter, how wonderful it is that we have a chief rabbi who several months later thought through the point that was raised to him and got back and said, you know what, I've thought it through and there's some justice in your comments. Now, I thought what the chief rabbi said in this particular case was perfect, but he thought it through and took the criticism on board. That's a wonderful thing. So here I use an example of the chief rabbi simply to share a great example of Jewish leadership and someone who considers and reflects the decisions they make and responds appropriately. And I hope that the whole leadership, both rabbinic and lay and national, global, political, will all think through what's happened over the last few months and hopefully learn some lessons. But I think it is absolutely fair and right to say that lessons need to be learned, but I think we'll have to do so on an appropriate and calm, reflective manner. I'll just say a couple more comments about rabbinic leadership, though. I think it's important that every area of responsibility respects the professionalism and knowledge and insight of everyone else. And consumers of rabbinic leadership, or any form of leadership, understand rabbinic expertise. And I don't buy into the supposed Das Torah model that somehow rabbinic leaders have unique insight into every aspect and angle of decision making. Hopefully, good rabbinic leadership has insight into Torah and halacha and hashkafa, and hopefully are able to offer good leadership in that manner. But there's different areas of expertise, and in our situation, the experts we need to turn to first to understand the facts are the doctors, after which we then need to understand the halachic application of the information given by the doctors. And it's important not to mix the categories in this case as in so many others. And therefore, I share a concern when rabbinic leadership oversteps its marks, or any form of leadership oversteps its marks. And I think each area of leadership needs to recognize the authority and insight of fellow experts. And I think it's wholly appropriate that at this time, halacha mandates of rabbanim and poskim to seek advice from doctors and accordingly paskin appropriately. So, Anna, I hope that that's some sort of answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dev.
Okay, any other questions?
I have, Rabbi, it's Brett here.
Oh, hi, Brett, yes.
Hi. So I guess the question sounds similar, but really it's not. How should the Jewish community, what should the Jewish community learn from this, and how should it change once we all get back to normal life? And I'd say, you know, the Northwest London Jewish community, but obviously focusing on our community. What positive changes do you see should happen, if at all, to our community?
I'm going to make a few general comments about that very important question. The first one is, I think all authentic response to difficulty has to come from an internal dynamic, and things are really only authentic when they come from within ourselves. One of the strengths of halacha and community is that it provides a framework for feelings, for emotions, for how to respond to situations, how to move with the calendar. But that framework can become emptied of meaning if we don't fill it with our own inner content, and it can become superficial. And this is the criticism voiced against halachic Judaism throughout the ages. The breakaways from halachic Judaism, whether from the breakaway of Christianity or later reformist movements, have very often been around this point that halacha becomes overly legalistic and people lose inner content. And that criticism, that critique, is not an unfair one. The Nevi'im themselves voiced it. And they spoke about mitzvahs odom l'modah. They spoke about mitzvahs becoming rote, lomali rov zivchechem, korbanos, sacrifices, just becoming empty gestures, and us losing sight of what Hashem really wants from us, which is our own internal change and our care and compassion and relationship with others, with ourselves, with the needy, with Hashem, with appreciation of the world we live in. And this is a legitimate criticism. It's not a criticism that should be used as it was used by Christianity and others to throw out the halachic system, but it's a legitimate criticism to make us aware of how halacha can go wrong and be abused. And the experience we're going through now, when we don't have the same communal structures, when we're davening by ourselves, and rightly so, because we're looking after our health, when we aren't in chevra, when we aren't in community, when we aren't mixing with others in the same way, gives us the unique chance to think about what we really are, what we call in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew, pnimiyut, to think about my pnim, my inner life. What do I really value? Who am I? What really matters to me? What's my personal journey? What do I think I'm uniquely equipped to do in the world, to contribute to the world, to change in myself, to change in the meaningful and important relationships that matter to me? How can I make a difference? And we need to ask ourselves these personal questions. So that's the first reflection I would have on the situation. I think it definitely, in isolation, gives us the opportunity to think a little bit about pnima and authenticity. And for that reason, I don't want to give an overly prescriptive response, which reflects my own personal views, as to the changes and the impact it should have on all of us. Having said that, I'll add another few thoughts, some of which I've shared with the community already. I've spoken about uncertainty and the empathy with those who always or often live with uncertainty. And at the moment now, we're all living with fear, we're all living with uncertainty. All of us have anxiety about health of near and dear friends. We have financial anxiety, we're stressed by isolation. And there are many others who the whole time go through this, who very often don't have the security that we perhaps fool ourselves into thinking that we do have, and perhaps the whole time lurch from crisis to crisis, whether in terms of physical health or financial health or mental health or family crises and other such things. And this should really remind us of in terms of empathy, of that life experience. It should also strip away the illusions we have as to our safety and our security. And we sometimes fool ourselves that somehow in the 21st century in the Western world, we're in control, and we are not in control. We are as much in God's hands as ever. And that should remind us of those truths of life. It should remind us to appreciate the gifts of life that we have every single day and every single moment. And really, the only way any of us as human beings can deal with the difficulty of life, the pain of life, the bereavements that we all will go through and do go through, is to remind ourselves to appreciate the gifts that we have every day. So my personal thoughts, I've spoken about appreciation, I've spoken about empathy, I've spoken about recognition of the truth of our existence, our ultimate vulnerability, and I think these are also important things to think about. And I think we should translate those into action. They should be translated into immediate action and long-term action. Immediate action in terms of perhaps expressing our appreciation. We all daven, but I struggle with tefillah. I think we all struggle with tefillah. It's repetitive. It's hard to know what it means. It's hard to know what it's saying. But tefillah is the only means we have to express to God our appreciation. So if we can use this opportunity, perhaps to learn through some of the translation of tefillah, to take a good sitter, or to take an online commentary and learn it and read and understand better tefillah, perhaps once a day, to ensure that we say from our hearts a few moments of prayer, me in English, and we just turn to God, Rachmana Libaboya, Hashem wants our hearts, and we turn to God and just speak to him for 1 minute in English and say thank you and say what's on our hearts, and get used to, as a habit, to speak to Hashem and share what we're feeling and what we want and what we dream of and what our aspirations of. These are great things to do in tefillah and prayer. And then to turn to people that matter to us in life, to phone up friends and family, for every hug that we can't give physically, to give a virtual hug, to phone up the people that perhaps we don't say how much they mean to us, how much they matter to us, how much we love them and how much we appreciate them, and to turn to them and say that. Again, this is a unique opportunity to do that. And the power of a little text, the power of a phone call is massive. Perhaps all of us can spend a few moments thinking about people who have made a difference in our lives, who perhaps we're not in contact with, we don't see anymore. This can be a kindergarten teacher, this can be a primary school teacher, this can be a mentor who we had many years ago, this can be a good friend who has now moved to another part of the world. And in this moment when actually distance is bridged, and it doesn't matter whether the guy is living in New Zealand or Israel or around the corner from us, that we can only have a Zoom or a phone call or a text, let's just go through in our minds all those people and just drop them a note of thanks. And let's turn to those who are nearest and dearest to us, our spouses, our parents, our children, our siblings, and say thank you to them and express appreciation to them. Let's think about perhaps the experiences we've taken for granted, whether health or community or shul or davening with a minyan, and perhaps we've been a bit slapdash about, we don't bother coming on time or we don't treat with the right respect. And again, just think about the opportunities we've had that we don't have and now that we miss. So I think those are some general reflections and thoughts. But here I want to come to what I think is perhaps the most important thing that can be said, which is, you asked what will be the long-term effect of this on us. And the answer is most probably 0 or close to 0, unless we take concrete action. Because this isn't the first time that our nation, it's not the first time as Jews, it's not the first time as British Jews, as citizens of the UK, it's not the first time we've been through tough times. Our people have been through tough times, Jewish people have been through tough times, the UK has been through tough times, and we've all been through personal tough times. We've all suffered loss in our life at some stage or other, whether financial or bereavement or health or whatever it may be. And yet when we emerge from that, we forget very quickly what's happened. And it's fascinating how the transition from Pesach to the Omer is really about this. Pesach is above time. It's about an experience that happens b'chipazon, in a rush. One moment we were slaves and the next moment we were free. The matzah didn't even have time to rise. And you have this exhilarating journey that we went on, ups and downs of the transition out of Egypt. And it's the most phenomenal national experience that could happen. Above time and in no way rational or systematic. And then immediately we move into the most systematic and measured time of year in the Jewish calendar, the Omer. And we count day by day by day the experiences. And that's the only way to make the change from the exhilaration of a Pesach to the tangible, concretized experience of a Shavuot. The only way to do that is counting day by day. And Limnos Yomenu Kenoda, the possibility of counting days is really at the basis of a Jewish ethical system. The Muslim movement spoke about this. And if we can think about how we can make tangible, how we can concretize, how we can take on very specific commitments which are small but real and doable and already now can be actioned, then there's a possibility that some of this change will last. If we take on commitments that are big, it won't last. If we take on things that don't yet apply, that aren't tangible, that aren't concrete, it won't apply. Abstract values don't work. It has to be immediately put into some form of concrete action. This is the basis of the halachic system, which is skeptical about faiths that just talk about love and charity and don't exercise love and charity. We immediately talk about charity and then we try and concretize it. Misa, how do I take charity? Who do I give it to? What's the best way to do it? What percentage? How do I do the calculations? What's the order of priorities? And so on and so forth. And before you know it, you've got an 8-volume set of laws of tzedakah. But the value behind that is that if things aren't immediately concretized and made specific, they don't last and they prove intangible. And therefore, I think definitely now we need to use this time to make things tangible and real. And I'll finish off just with one more insight into what the Omer means. 49 days of counting to get to Shavuos. Each day, just think, before we go to bed, what have I done today? What have I achieved? What have I learned? Set yourself 3 targets for the day that you're going to do every day. Maybe one intellectual, one emotional, one in action. And at the end of every day, just think, have I achieved those? And if you haven't, then achieve them now. If you haven't done something, an expression of love or care for someone, then go and do that expression of love and care. Go and say something to someone, send a text. If you haven't learned something that day, then just read for a quarter of an hour. Have online or by your bedside a book where you can read a short Dvar Torah, short thoughts, a short philosophical idea, something Musa, something about ethical development, something that will offer insight into self-improvement. But that is what the Omer should be about. It's meant to be about counting days and therefore using the opportunity for growth. And I think in the same way as we have to make the transition from the chipazon, the rush and exhilaration of this incredible journey of Pesach into the concretization of a Shavuos and the counts, I think that's the only way the experience that we have can become tangible and have a long-term effect on us.
Rabbi Zobin, I have a question which follows on from that, if that's okay. I'd like to start with what my question isn't and then go on to what my question is. My question is not about the 3,000 years worth of philosophy about why good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people. It's also not about what you've spoken about previously with the Rambam's approach on one side and the Ramban's on another. But I'd like to ask this. We have a principle that when Hashem gives permission to the mashchis, to the destroyer has permission to go to whoever. So to use a practical, concrete example, as you've just spoken about, I noticed, Baruch Hashem, we have Simon Gold on this call. If I was a very righteous yid, if I was a chas v'shalom, a wicked yid, if I was a goy, if I had 20 dependents dependent on me, if I had no one depending on me, but I had shaken Simon's hand, I would also have the coronavirus because Hashem has given permission to the mashchis to destroy. How are we supposed to understand how Hashem relates to us when he can give permission to a malach with that kind of power?
Right. First of all, I hadn't seen it because he's not showing on my screen that Simon is here, but I do want to take this opportunity to say that Simon, I am honoured and privileged to have you here in the on the forum and listening to us. I think anyone who knows Simon knows that he is a truly remarkable individual who gives beyond words, above and beyond any, in an indescribable manner to our community. Day after day after day, and exceptional acts of kindness and communal responsibility and care. And Simon, it's the most wonderful and incredible, joyous experience to know that you're on the road to recovery. And I want to take this opportunity to wish you a refuah shalema and a complete recovery, and looking forward to having you back in good health. So Simon, just knowing you're here in the Zoom meeting brings me exceptional emotion and happiness. So thank you for being here and giving that simcha to us.
Amen.
Hello, Simon. Sorry, you've just come up on the screen. Mark, in terms of your question, you said that you're not referring to what I spoke about on my non-Shabbat Hagadol drasha, but I'm afraid I do have to refer you back to that. And the answer to your question is, well, it's a subject to debate, believe it or not. Those are the 2 schools of thought that I presented then in the Shabbos Hagadol drasha, and actually this gives me an opportunity to address something else that I was asked, which is, are there any middle positions on this topic? I presented 2 extremes simply because in the hour available, that was all I could address, and it was simplest to present 2 extremes. But there's a range of positions on this matter. But for now, I will simply address the same 2 extremes that I mentioned then. And quick plug here. For those who are interested, I have a series of shiurim, which I gave on my Sunday morning Ner philosophy shiurim, in which I deal with much more nuance, the different perspectives. But vision number one would be that every single experience that any of us undergo, and certainly a significant one, like the coronavirus, is directly and specifically targeted to us, individuals, due to Hashem's vision of our life plan and our purpose and the spiritual goals we need to achieve. And viruses are sufficiently complicated that how we catch them and when we catch them is not an obvious or automatic process. It's one that's controlled by probably under the input of chaos theory. I can be standing several meters away from someone, and if a gust of wind happens to occur, then I can either breathe in the virus or not, and that can have the effect on my health or not. And this is well within the realm of science, in which it gets down to really the random movements of quantum particles. Even that's how significant it can be. And similarly, how my immune system reacts and whether it's capable of responding quickly or not. These are things that are really not well understood by science, and there's plenty of room for that model of hashgacha pratis, for the understanding that how the virus affects me and when it affects me is absolutely biyad Hashem, fine-tuned to my personal experience. And in that model, exactly the experience that each and every one of us went through or are going through in our health is perfectly tuned to our individual life journey. The opposite extreme would agree that this is biyad Hashem, it's in the hands of God, but by that it is meant that Hashem created us as physical human beings who are caught up in physical experiences, and therefore what happens to us is affected by the physical world within which we live and the laws of science and nature which Hashem has created us within, including how we are, including our health and how our health affects us. We have some control over it. Chazal say hakol b'dei shamayim chutz mit sinin or pachin. Our health, fevers and colds can be affected by our own behavior. To what degree we follow guidelines and wash our hands and other such things, but some events may be out of our control and we're caught up in the laws of physics. So how then are we meant to relate to Hashem in this model? The answer is we need to relate to Hashem as physical human beings, and we need to say, I've been through this tough experience and I'm now going to put in incredible and exceptional avodas Hashem to try and draw out that which is positive from it. And what can I draw out positive from my difficult experience? Well, I'll share with you the words that Simon shared with me as he was going through them. And Simon, again, forgive me for embarrassing you, but Simon spoke about working on positivity, working on appreciation, working on his betochen and trust in Hashem, working on a connection to the experience he was going through, to being able to celebrate in a positive manner what could have been a terrible and lonely Seder there in Pesach, and so on and so forth. And many people who go through very difficult experiences speak about positivity and lessons and growth that they could draw out of it. And I'm aware as I'm speaking that this is a hard message to say, because life can be terrible and awful. But in this model, what can we say? This is the reality of life. The reality of life is we are physical beings, we are mortal, we will all go through tough experiences, we will all lose at some stage in our lives those who are most precious to us, those who are nearest and dearest to us. And what else can we do but say that as human beings, this is how we are created, and now we need to draw spirituality out of that. We need to create our own meaning. We need to see in these experiences the positives we can draw out of it, and we can. And we spoke about some of the positives of accepting vulnerability and using it to appreciate better, using it to empathize better, and some of the other ideas that I discussed when I spoke about when I spoke to Brett about his question. So, Mark, I hope that addresses what you've asked.
Thank you.
I have a question here on the in the chat, which I'll answer also. This was a question posed to me privately, and then I'm happy to take another question live. And I was asked about, with shuls closed and mikvaot closed to men and gyms closed, they're seen as a high-risk environment. So why are women's mikvaot not being closed and halachic alternatives being sourced? But we know that COVID can linger in the air, etc., etc. How can it be safe to use the mikvaot? So I'll just address this very briefly by saying that at the moment now, those who are running the mikvaot have consulted and worked very, very closely with the leading medical advice that they can receive. And the advice given, and again, I'm not a doctor and everyone should seek their own advice, but the advice given is that, as far as we can understand, the mikvahot are safe. Women can do the preparation and should do the preparation at home, literally go in, dip and leave and come out. And the water is very heavily chlorinated, many times the level at which anyone thinks the virus can possibly survive. And therefore, as far as we can understand, there isn't a danger in so doing. However, obviously one has to constantly update the advice in line with the best advice that we've been given, and people ultimately need to make their own medical decisions based upon the best advice that they get. I'm not going to, in this forum, discuss this further, other than to say, if anyone wishes to discuss it further, please feel free to contact my wife or myself off group, and we can talk through some of the halachic implications and so on. So that was a question off on the chat.
Can I ask a question, Rabbi Zobin?
Yes, Michelle.
It's not nearly as philosophical, I can't even say the word, as the others. But anyway, it's sort of much more practical. Now that we're coming, well, we're saying the Omer, and normally we're not allowed to hear music or theatre or anything like that. Obviously, we can't go to anything, but we hear, you know, we've got the opportunity to hear lots of and see a lot of stuff on Zoom and TV. So what are the restrictions? What can we do? What can't we do? We're all in a period of mourning anyway, so I don't know if that's taken into account.
Okay, an important question, and thank you for that. So I'll answer it on two levels. I'll use it as a chance just to speak a little bit about the general halachas of the Omer, and I'll also make some comments about our general situation and the halachic implication of that. The general rule of the Omer is the prohibition, the long-standing prohibition on music during the Omer, initially was created as a restriction on dance and dance music, not other forms of music. Over time, a minhag built up around this to be more careful than that and to include other forms of music also. However, in situations of where one needs or wishes to engage more fully with music, especially whilst exercising, perhaps whilst trying to concentrate when doing work, people that do long drives and need music to keep them engaged and awake in a healthy way, and other such things. Music which is both neither live nor dance, according to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, is allowed. If it's not dance music and it's not the live music, in his view, it doesn't fulfill the criteria of music that was prohibited in the Omer, and certainly that's sufficient to rely upon if there's a particular reason to listen to this music. So this is a specific answer to the question you raised. Similarly, one can listen to watch TV programs or online or whatever it may be, as long as they are not music centered. So if it's neither a musical nor takes its theme around music, but it's just a general form of entertainment and happens to have some mood music in the background to create tension or atmosphere or whatever it may be, that is also allowed and not included within what shouldn't take place in the Omer. So this would be a general response. This year, I would add that people should be more conscious of well-being and tension and their mental health and other such things. And it's hard to give a general Pesach or guideline based upon that, other than to say that if one is worried about one's mood and well-being, one's feeling tense and so on, then definitely this year, please do listen to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman's Pesach and listen to music and just avoid dance music. In truth, if someone is really worried about it, then that would supersede any prohibition of music, including dance music. But I think in general, for most people, avoiding dance music should be able to be done in a healthy way, and listening to other music should be sufficient. I'll comment a little more generally on some of the general psukim that have been floating around, and I find myself treading a tightrope over the last few weeks, because on the one hand, I am nervous and uncomfortable with some of the guidelines that are given out as a sort of general Pesach that this year much that is normally prohibited is allowed. I don't quite think that's how halacha works. I think halacha has to be very sensitive to stress and difficulties and health, including, of course, well-being and mental health. But equally, I think it's not simple when a general Pesach is given, which somehow negates halachic consensus. So that's one side of the tightrope. The other side of the tightrope, though, is for people to understand that how important well-being and mental health is, and for halacha to respond appropriately to that. And for people to know that shilas should be asked case by case, scenarios should be discussed in order to ensure that everyone is well and looked after. There was a lot of discussion around the internet about a Pesach that came out allowing Zoom Sidorim. And I felt that this Pesach issued as a general Pesach was incorrect. Using a Zoom for a Seder when both the speaker and the recipient are keeping Yom Tov. It's true one doesn't need to switch the Zoom on in advance, one can have it preset, but one is deliberately trying to use that form of social media and the computer to communicate over distances, which is exactly the misuse of electricity that isn't allowed on Shabbos and Yom Tov. It's very different to a CCTV, where, as I walk down Brent Street, I'm always observed by the CCTV, but I have no interest in it observing me and filming me. All I want it to record is if there's a criminal out there. I have no interest in it recording a safe walk, unless it's a situation of danger, in which case, again, that would trump it. So, halachically, I don't think there was a correct Pesach, that there is a get-out-of-jail-free card to do this. Moreover, I don't think electricity is a small area. I think as Jews who care about Yiddishkeit, about orthodoxy, and engagement with the modern world, I think we all recognize that perhaps there's no greater example of what preserves Shabbos than the halachic ban on using social media on Shabbos. And were this to become an area of halacha that was weakened, it would destroy Shabbat. And I think it's a remarkable application of halacha that discussions that took place 100 years ago about 15-watt light bulbs in hovels in East Europe or wherever it may be, in North Africa, applied then, have had the practical application now in the modern world to ensure that we don't misuse electricity. So no one at the time was thinking about email and social media and so on. Electricity was looked at as an abstract halachic concept, and yet the application of it has ensured that Shabbos is preserved into the modern world. And as I said on the JTV clip when I was interviewed, beyond the malachas of Shabbos, the 39 technical malachot of Shabbos, there's also the concept of Shabbaton. Shabbos is a day which has to have a Shabbos atmosphere. It's also a Torah concept. It's a halachic concept, and use of social media would ruin that. So I think the idea that a general Pesach should be given out and issued that Zoom can be used this year is a mistake, is a complete misuse of halacha. But equally, it's clearly appropriate in certain situations. A phone call or a Zoom call must be made. People are alone and isolated and frail and fragile and so on, need to be contacted over 3 days Yom Tov. And therefore it's right that the issue should be raised rabbinically, but equally, I don't think that should become then a diktat in which a general Pesach is issued. I think it needs to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. And many of you here did discuss such situations with me, and on many occasions I said to people, it's appropriate and a must to make a call on Yom Tov for Shabbos, in order that vulnerable people shouldn't be alone for 3 days. So I think we need to find that balance between demonstrating how halacha needs to apply to particular circumstances, and at the same time not give sweeping rulings that undermine what are very important halachas. And therefore, Michelle, in terms of your question about the Omer, as I said, the application of the Omer is by minhag extension to many all sorts of music. However, Rabbi Zobin believes it was allowed for recorded music that's non-dance, and that's certainly right in the case of someone who is exercising or studying or and so on. And beyond that, absolutely, if someone is struggling with their mood and well-being, mental health and well-being and so on, absolutely the halacha in that case should be superseded. But beyond that, I think each case needs to be looked at individually. I have a couple of questions on the chat, which I'm happy to take, unless someone wants to ask me something live. Okay, I'll take... I'll take a couple of questions. The shul's response to Boris Johnson being in ICU, what are the pros and cons that resulted in the shul not including this explicitly in our services? Well, first of all, as you know, unfortunately at the moment we don't have regular services. The most we have is the Zoom services, which are very important, and I'll take this chance to thank Gary and Charles Pascoe, who amongst others have been particularly instrumental in making them happy. Thank you to Happen and David Brotson, I should mention also, and Simon Balsam, who in general has got all our Zoom going. So thank you for that. Again, I don't want to speak about this too much at length, other than to say that public responses and changes to ritual services are always things that need to be done in moderation. And given the brevity of his stay in intensive care, I felt that this was something that everyone needed to make their own judgment call about davening for, rather than something that I felt should be a sort of communal response. I'm very conscious of a limit to the number of emails that can be sent and the limit to the number of sort of public policies that can be sent. I've sent more messages to the community by email over the last few weeks than before, including the guidance to the upcoming days of Yom Tov, and including the frequently asked questions for Pesach, and reiterating again and again the importance of listening to doctors in terms of isolation and various other things. And therefore I felt that a sort of email about a formal change to the structure of tefillah and introducing an extra tefillah was not appropriate. However, it would have been and is appropriate for every individual who is sensitive to anyone who is ill to daven for them. I've been asked about tefillah for non-Jews at this time if people are unwell, and the answer is of course. I mean, God forbid to say otherwise, absolutely and definitely. If you're aware of a friend, a colleague, a neighbor who is unwell, of course we should daven for them. And the nusach that we use in Rafa'enu is Sosha Chol Yisrael, talks about Chol Yisrael, and therefore that nusach would need to be adapted for Shema Kolenu or for the end of Amidah, and therefore appropriately davened for anyone. Obviously, one wouldn't be able to use a Shem Kodesh in this case, but one absolutely should daven. We say on Yom Noraim, we describe the Beis HaMikdash as Ki Beisi, Beis Tefillah L'Chol Ha'amim. My house, says God, the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, is a Beis Tefillah, a Beit Tefillah, a home, a house of prayer, L'Chol Ha'amim, for all nations, for all people. Tefillah is not meant to be a uniquely Jewish experience. Anyone can engage in Tefillah, and similarly, we should daven for anyone, including our precious neighbors and fellow citizens, if they are going through difficult times. I'll also use this chance to mention a Pesach halacha, which I heard from one of my mentors, one of my teachers, in the name of Rabbi Leib Diskin. Forgive me if I mentioned this before to the shul, I don't remember. But Rabbi Leib Diskin moved from East Europe to Yerushalayim some 150 years ago. He was one of the rabbinic leaders of the old Yishuv, for those who know the history of the time. And there he encountered Muslims in practice, in prayer service. And he paskened that if one sees a Muslim in prayer, one is not allowed to walk in front of them within Daled Amos, within 4 Amos. The halacha is that someone who's davening Amidah, a Jew who is davening Amidah, we shouldn't walk in front of them within Daled Amos, within 4 Amot, approximately 6 feet, just under 2 meters. We shouldn't walk within this measure in front of them. And he paskened that this applied to a Muslim in prayer, because the Muslim in prayer is engaged with tefillah to the same God as we daven to, as we pray to, and therefore one shouldn't walk in front of them either. Tefillah is a universal concept, and one that applies to Jew and non-Jew. Anyone can daven, and similarly we should, and it is appropriate for us to daven for anyone in need. I'll take, if there's a live question, I'm happy to take that. Otherwise, again, I'll go to the chat on the side. I've been asked here, with the enormous economic fallout from the current situation, can I give some guidance on priority in tzedakah giving? So it's something I've struggled with myself over the last few weeks. I'll use this question as an excuse to make an appeal. If people are in a position to be able to donate and help, please do so, either directly to myself or via the Gemach. The situation is difficult. Those who are self-employed have experienced an immediate loss of income. Many people have been put on furlough or have had their income significantly reduced. People are already struggling. It's a devastating situation. People have stable and strong businesses in which, with forethought and planning, they've created contingency scenarios. What is a contingency scenario? You plan for a 5% drop in sales, a 10% drop, a 15%, but who prepares for sometimes a 90 or 100% drop off? So the situation is tough, and I'll use this question about tzedakah to ask for help in this. At the moment now, I think we're firefighting a little bit because the situation is so much in flux and so unclear. And at the moment, it's about getting people through Yom Tov and Pesach and having enough for them to put on the table for their families. And that's the first priority. As the situation settles down and things become a little clearer, hopefully we'll get a clearer picture also about the extent and the long-term nature of the economic damage done. I think the hope is that if things can get back to relative normal fairly fast, then the government support that's been put in place will allow a bounce back and things to lift immediately. If it continues longer, then there may be long-term damage. There probably already will be long-term damage, but deeper long-term damage. And at that point, there'll probably be easier for us to sort of form a coherent and long-term vision about tzedakah and how tzedakah can help people best. But the general rule, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, is that we need to look both at the recipient and the nature of the support they need. In terms of recipient, charity begins at home. Every so often I'll get a shaila in Hilchas Maaseh about giving to a parent or a sibling, and the answer is absolutely yes and yes. If one's parents or one's siblings are in financial need, that's where it starts. The second stage is community and locality, and then afterwards further around the world. So those are the orders of priority. We need to start helping at home, number one. And number two, where possible, help should be sustainable. Help should be in a manner in which people are given long-term sustained support and allowed to become financially viable and back on their feet again, rather than needing constant support. Sometimes that will be possible, sometimes not, depending obviously on the background. I believe that the Shul Michelle is in the process of looking into options for us to actually bring someone in to speak about, not bring in virtually via Zoom, to speak about how to deal with financial difficulties, and both on many levels, some of the steps we can take in our own lives to perhaps help ourselves weather this storm. But I think that's a little bit of an answer in terms of Hilchas Tzedakah. Sustainable long-term is a priority if one can help invest in someone to get back on their own feet. And in terms of starting closer to home, those are just a couple of the halachic parameters that apply. I would mention that someone who is going through difficulty making their own ends meet, the expectation to give a tenth, a maaseh to tzedakah, would not necessarily apply in such a case. It needs to be looked at on an individual basis. If one's able to, live carefully and cut back a little and still keep maaseh going, that's appropriate. If one literally isn't making ends meet, then the obligation of maaseh falls off. However, charity, tzedakah, remains an obligation on every one of us. So even if one's not in a financial position to give maaseh, one should give some tzedakah. That's point number one. And point number two in Hilchas Maaseh, and I spoke about this in the Friday night series, 60 seconds halacha, is that maaseh is tithed post-expenses. So it's post-tax and post-other expenses involved in earning one's living. So commuting costs and other such things are deducted, but other living expenses are not normally deducted before one looks at one's income for maaseh. So that's a summary, I hope, of some of the pertinent tzedakah halachas. Any other live questions?
Rabbi Zobin, Jeffrey.
Jeffrey, yes.
Hi. There's a lot of talk about Ikvus of the Mashiach, the times of Mashiach coming, and particularly in these difficult times, and people looking out for signs from Chazal. Chazal set out different parameters and things that we could look forward to by looking at different signs. On the other hand, there's the other school of thought, which is those who know don't say, and those who say don't know, that we shouldn't really be looking at all for signs, and just when it comes, it comes. How do you think we should address this balance?
Okay, so Ikvus of the Mashiach, are we living in the era of Messianic era? Is anything happening now indicative that Mashiach is immediately, imminently due? I'll start off with stating the obvious, that if you get a text that tells you that Rabbi X saw his grandfather, Rabbi Y, in a dream, and said that Mashiach is coming, and that you need to forward this text to 12 people, otherwise you'll break the chain and Mashiach won't come, then don't believe it. If Mashiach won't come because you haven't forwarded the text, then we're in a mess, my goodness. Quite possibly Mashiach might be assisted in coming by not forwarding texts, but forwarding text certainly doesn't assist in him coming. I say this simply because I received several of these, not from anyone here, by the way, I should say, but obviously don't, these things are nonsense. Those who claim some inner knowledge as to when Mashiach is coming are b'chezkat. The assumption is that they are talking nonsense, and do not have any form of inner knowledge or insight into this. The Nevi'im themselves admitted that they did not understand fully what would trigger and what signs would indicate Mashiach coming. The Gemara talks about very general signs, but nothing specific. The Rambam paskins that we don't know the exact things that will indicate at an early stage Mashiach. We'll only have clarity once the process itself is in action. So I guess that's the headlines of what I would say, which is that we don't know when Mashiach is coming. From a historical perspective, the idea that somehow the events we're going through are so awful and dramatic that they must indicate that Mashiach is coming is completely ahistorical and complete nonsense. In the range of tough Jewish experiences or world experiences that people have been through, this really is negligible. Thank God, Baruch Hashem, we're in general, as a community, as a nation, globally dealing with this. There's been many exceptionally painful personal experiences, but that doesn't translate into a national or international crisis that's comparable with some of the experiences of the Jewish people in the last century and over the last millennia. So and we shouldn't lose sight of that. We're living, thank God, in overall a blessed age of great security and health and wealth and so on. And it's important that we see things in proportion. And the idea that somehow what's happening now is so terrible that it must indicate the end of history is simply non-historical and inaccurate. I also think that some of the pseudo-spiritual insight that's offered as to what's going on and what we can do about it and what this must indicate is simply people trying to clutch onto straws of fooling themselves that somehow we control the levers of history and somehow we have unique insight into what's happening and why, and we know the secrets of the universe. We know the magic buttons that can ensure our safety and tell us about what's happening. And to me, this is a terrible thing, because just like we repudiate the hubris, the arrogance of those who think that there are simple secular solutions for us becoming the masters of the universe, Judaism doesn't call upon us to think that there are simple spiritual solutions to allow us to be the masters of the universe. If there's any lesson in what's going on, it's that we are not the masters of the universe. There is one Ribono Shel Olam, there's one master with a capital M of the universe, and we are his creatures, and we are in his hands. And to comfort ourselves with the false comfort of somehow thinking that we have unique insight and therefore we can read history is delusional and dangerous, and it means we're missing the point of the message that we're meant to be hearing at the moment, which is that we are not in control. And this phenomena was found in history, in which there were Nevi'ei Sheker, there were false prophets who offered cheap and inaccurate reassurance to the Jewish people before the Churban Beis Hamikdash and at other times, and in which they claimed to have insight into the divine and insight into the plans of the universe, and they didn't, and it was dishonest. And it's wrong and sad and hard to see that people are playing this game again. So I would say in the strongest possible terms, our job is not to try and predict this sort of thing. And what is our job? To try and be the best we can, to try and step by step, act by act, make the world and ourselves a better place and make the right decisions by, by doing that which we're meant to do, by trying to do mitzvahs and halacha and chesed and tzedakah and kindness and tefillah and the other things that the halachic system and the Torah teaches us and morals teach us are the right things to do. And that is the way to take it, rather than trying to engage in time-wasting speculation beyond that.
Thank you.
Someone wrote, it feels good to be part of a virtual minyan each morning and evening, but is this something we should make a real effort to be part of? If it helps you, and if it is a positive experience, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, then yes, absolutely, one should make a real effort to be part of it. What do I mean if it helps one? If it either enhances one's tefillah, and one is able to daven better, have a better structure to one's day, engage more deeply and profoundly with tefillah, ensure that one does daven, then absolutely it's the right thing to do. Similarly, if it gives one much needed contact with and sense of community, then again, that's the right thing to do. And for that reason, as a community, we've been strongly encouraging people to take part in it. I think it's something very, very positive and very good that is well worthwhile doing. There may be particular reasons why people can't do it. They may be timing related, they may be technical, actually they find they daven better without the distraction of a Zoom tefillah going on. And in that case, there is no halachic obligation to do it because it isn't technically a minyan. But were it to enhance one's tefillah, then yes, it's the appropriate and right thing to do. I'll take this chance just to mention, I don't think I've covered this in addressing the community. Maybe I have. In fact, I have covered it, and I won't discuss it again. Those have put forward the view that somehow through Zoom a minyan can be created. That's not my view halachically, and it's not the view of most of those who have looked at this issue and understand the topic. However, for those of us who are not treating this as a minyan, nonetheless, it's a good thing to do, and it enhances tefillah. So I would encourage everyone to at least give it a try and see how it goes. And having a structure to one's tefillah is only a good thing. And once again, thanks to the Gaboim who have made it work, and thanks to our Bali Tefillah. I've got another question here in the chat group. I'm happy to take live questions if there are any. This will probably be the last question I take in my allotted hour, so if anyone wants to ask something live, please do so.
Rabbi Zobin, I know I've been on, but just because of what you said on Zoom, many people say that the rabbinate should permit Kaddish at the end for those Avelim who have been unable to, or lost somebody during this crisis, have been unable to do so. Can you address that issue? Because somebody raised it with you on one of these chats, but I think you took it off group.
Okay, so thank you, Alan. Thank you for giving me the chance then to address that, because it deserves addressing. I first of all don't exactly know what it means when it says the rabbinate should permit this or shouldn't permit this. There was an article written in a Jewish newspaper of, I believe, of blessed memory, as things currently stand. I think it's announced that it will be closing down, in which someone wrote a very strong condemnation of the rabbinate, who should have announced this year that kitnias don't apply, and should have announced that secondary Yom Tov doesn't apply because of the circumstances. And they wrote that that the rabbinate serves its consumers very poorly. Well, the idea that religion is a sort of consumer driven product is it's very 21st century Western idea, but that's not what religion really is about. And halacha doesn't work like that. So the first point I was making is we need to work out whether halachically this works and is possible. My view, and the view of 99.9% plus of Rabbanim who have looked at this issue, is that one cannot create a minyan over Zoom. And I'll just explain very briefly the halachic concept and run through the ideas. Question number one about Zoom is, can one answer amen to a bracha heard through Zoom and the like? And the answer is yes, one can. And the source to this is the large synagogue in Alexandria, in which people at the back couldn't hear the bracha said by the Baal Tefillah at the front, and a flag was waved to indicate when the bracha was concluded, at which point they could say amen. And hearing a bracha over the phone is no worse than that. You know a bracha has taken place, and therefore you can answer amen to it. So that's not controversial. The second question is, can one fulfill one's obligation over Zoom, for example, listening to the Megillah? And the primary source for this is the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, which I've spoken about before, which talks about a shofar blown into the pit. If you hear the echo, you do not fulfill your obligation, and therefore most poskim say, in the same way as you can't, if you hear the echo of the shofar, you haven't fulfilled your obligation, because it's not the shofar sound itself, it's the bounce back of the sound off the wall. Similarly, if you hear the shofar or the Megillah over the phone line, you're not hearing the actual shofar or Megillah, you're merely hearing the electronic signal of the phone, and therefore you cannot fulfill the obligation. The minority view, but a respected minority view, is that of Moshe Feinstein, who says that the issue with the echo is not that it has bounced off the wall. Every time we hear sounds, we hear it through the laws of physics, and therefore hearing it through the electric ether is no different than that. We've still heard it through the laws of physics, and therefore one can fulfill the mitzvah. The issue with echo is that it is both delayed and distorted. But if you can hear a sound that is neither delayed nor distorted, such as over Zoom or the phone, then one can, depending on the quality of your internet connection, then you can fulfill the mitzvah through that. And it is for that reason that those who could not make it to Megillah this year because they were in isolation should listen to the Megillah over the phone or Zoom, but not make a bracha. You can't make a bracha on it because the majority opinion is one doesn't fulfill the mitzvah. Nonetheless, it's worth listening because of the minority opinion that one can. Then the next question is, can one create a minyan through Zoom? And to say Kaddish, one needs a minyan. Kaddish is a dova shebikdusha, is a declaration of sanctity. And the Gemara tells us, Ein dova shebikdusha pachas me'asara, you need a minyan in order to say Kaddish or Kedusha. Now, there are extensive halachas about what creates a minyan, but in brief, it's the presence of 10 people together, and Zoom does not create 10 people being together in that way, and therefore you cannot create a minyan via Zoom, and this is the consensus of I think almost everyone who has looked at it, any posek, rather than someone who's just quoting the view of Rav Melamed. Now, Rav Melamed is the one who differs. Rav Melamed is an extraordinary Talmud Chacham. He has a beautiful set of halakhic works called Communual Halacha, which I highly recommend to everyone. And nonetheless, in this particular case, he has found himself in a minority. Most don't agree with him. I don't know of any other serious posek who agrees with him, not one. So I don't think you can create a minyan over Zoom, and therefore you cannot say Kaddish via Zoom. As I mentioned in my address to the community, I emailed Rav Melamed about his Pesach, and he himself did not advocate such a minyan. He had been quoted as advocating it. He did not advocate it. He said to me, consider the possibility of a minyan, but do not advocate making such a minyan. And I can send anyone the text of the email he sent me. So the one source of this himself introduced this idea as a halakhic speculation, curiosity, and something that he considered a possibility. And for those who were desperate to have it, would allow it. But he did not think this was best practice. Now, the reason it's not best practice is because, as I said, the majority do not think this is an appropriate way to do it. I do not think it's an option. And I think it makes us miss a more important point over here. Kaddish is one way of bringing an Iloi Neshama, is one way of elevating meaning and purpose and spirituality to those who we've tragically and painfully lost. The content of Kaddish is not a memorial prayer. We call it a memorial prayer. It has nothing about the past in it. It only speaks about the future. Look at the words of Kaddish. It talks about the world. It's all in the future tense. It talks about a world that we wish to have, a world of enhanced Kedusha, a world of enhanced Shalom, of peace, of revelation and awareness of Hashem. It all looks forward. And the reason Kaddish looks forward is because that is our approach to tragedy. We recognize the loss and the bereavement and the pain that's happened. And we acknowledge that there's nothing we can do about that. That loss has happened. And the most we can do is say, how can we carry forward what that person meant to us, what they are to us? How can we use that to grow and improve? And many who go through loss describe how a relationship does not cease upon bereavement and loss. It shifts, it changes, but the connection remains. The connection is eternal and is always there. The relationship doesn't stop. It just expresses itself in a different way. And Kaddish is a very important way of expressing that relationship, but there are other ways of doing it. And in some respects, other better ways of expressing that relationship. There are other better ways of bringing memory and Iloi Neshama to those we have lost, such as finding appropriate projects of chesed and tzedakah to take on. And I would say to anyone who is in a situation of being unable painfully to say Kaddish at the moment, think about what the person meant to you. Think about what they stood for. Think about what they inspired within you in terms of your own growth and your role as a spiritual person. And then try and do something inspired and taught by that person who is no longer. And that is a more than fitting way to say Kaddish for them. And I say from the bottom of my heart, with utmost sincerity, that is the Lachat Chila. That is absolutely an ideal in the current situation. And rather than trying to find second best ways of doing it, this is the Lachat Chila, and this is what we should do. Take the person who's lost and think about what they meant to one, and then find a mitzvah, find a chesed, find a tzedakah, find a halacha that one can grow in and improve and take on. And that is the appropriate way to bring an Ilon Neshama to them. So thank you, Alan, for not only opening the evening on this occasion, but also closing it with that important question. I'll just finish off by saying the following, and I say this with a heavy heart. There are still some minyanim across northwest London that are taking place. Minyanim that are taking place in the streets, in front gardens, in back gardens. This is a mistake. It's a terrible mistake. It is possible within the government guidelines that it can be done in a way which is legal, possibly if people stand at a distance and engage in isolation and so on. One of the things that's become clear over the last few weeks, and people spoke about rabbinic mistakes, and it's a lesson I've had to learn, and all of us have had to learn, is the government guidelines are written as general rules. They cannot take into consideration every single unique ethnic and cultural pattern of behavior. And our community is small, and we have our own way of operating. And if these minyanim take place, if we allow these minyanim to take place, then they will cause death, God forbid. They will cause people to become infected. They will, even if we think we can manage the minyan in a sensible way, they will lead to others not running the minyan in a sensible way, slippage, kids running across to each other, people crossing over into other homes to get access to the minyan. It will weaken our communal response to this, in which we need, and we've learned over the last few weeks. I have learned. I made mistakes, and we all made mistakes in this, and we have learned that we did not take this seriously enough, and we didn't understand it properly. Number one. Number two, the medical evidence is not that clear-cut. The government has given 2 meters as a general guideline. But again, it's not so clear-cut, depending on wind conditions and air pressure and other things. It's impossible it travels 3 meters or 4 meters or 8 meters. And again, why would we risk our lives it's making an idol out of tefillah b'tzibur and missing our priorities as Jews, which is we need to look after our health at this difficult time. And these minyanim are not acceptable, and they are not right. What do we do if we see a minyan taking place and we're sitting there in our homes crying because we desperately want to say Kaddish? Perhaps we're in our velos and we want to join this minyan and go out and take part in it. We have to know it's wrong. The best Ilon Neshama we can bring to the person we love and care for is by not joining the minyan. People have asked about reporting to the police these things that take place. I view these as pikuach nefesh, and if you see someone risking their lives, then of course one has to step in. Every case needs to be looked at in its own basis and in situation, and I'm sensitive and cognizant that there's neighborhood dynamics here and other such things, but I use that example simply to emphasize how seriously this needs to be taken. This is not Masira, this is not informing, this is saving lives. People who are the minyan will simply be picking up, and at worst there'll be a financial fine. It's not putting people in prison. It's we need to have our priorities straight, and it causes me exceptional pain that as a community, we haven't always got this right, and haven't always understood, and haven't always had our priorities straight. And therefore, in answer to someone who texted me privately, saying if there's a live minyan going on, can we join it and say Kaddish to them? I don't think that's the case. We shouldn't do so. If there are minyanim that are taking place internationally, and in particular old age homes and other such things, and people can get a Kaddish said then on a case-by-case basis, if people are aware of such things, then that's a possibility. I will finish by reminding everyone that we are in the midst of the Omer, so the time is now 9:39. We can all count the Omer. Thank you for the person who reminded me on the chat group to remind everyone, and I thank you all so much for joining. If I don't get the chance to speak to you before the onset of Chag tomorrow afternoon, then I'll wish you all a good second half of Yom Tov and a meaningful one. There will be Mincha tomorrow, besides the regular Shachris, there will be Mincha at 7:15, preceded by Yizkar at 7 o'clock. The email will come out shortly about that. There's no reason that Yizkar cannot take place this year on Erev Chag, on Erev Yom Tov, and we will do so late afternoon, led by our very own Malcolm Cohen, Thank you very much, Malcolm, for that and for inspiring the community on other ways, also via Zoom. And for those who have Yizkor, this is an appropriate way to join at 7 o'clock, after which Mincha will take place at 7:15, after which we will accept the onset of the second half of Chag. So I wish everyone a Chag Sameach, and I'm due to repurchase your Hamoed should our buyer choose to sell it back to me approximately quarter of an hour after the end of Chag on Motzi Yom Tov. So unless you get a panicky email from Louise or a WhatsApp from me saying that hasn't happened, you can assume that on Thursday evening that will have taken place. I wish you all a good second half of Yom Tov, good Yom Tov and Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hello, Rabbi Zobin.
Rabbi Zobin, thank you.
Hello.
Hello, is
Rabbi
that
Zobin?
Simon?
This is Simon Gold.
Hello, Simon.
Hi, just quickly to thank everybody who said tefillah, brachas, and wished me well over the last couple of weeks. It's great to be home. Great to be celebrating my Pesach with my family now. And I just want to thank everybody who's online, say thank you for everything you've done for me. It made a big difference.
I can't see.
Great to hear your voice, Simon.
So good
Simon, nice to see you.
Good to hear you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Zobin. Wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, providers.
Thank you.